Voter fraud, is there or isn't there? President Trump says yes. Many others not only say no, they say his Election Integrity Commission is a fraud. Today, the issue came to New Hampshire with a controversial election panel in town for a day of hearings, and it was not without some fireworks. This was the commission's second public meeting. It came just days after a report that more than 6,000 out-of-state driver's license holders registered to vote in New Hampshire on Election Day last November. Last week, the commission's vice chairman, Kansas Secretary of State Chris Kobach, cited the report as, quote, proof of evidence of voter fraud. Today, Kobach backed away from that, saying that his statement that fraudulent votes appeared to lead to Democrat Maggie Hassan's very narrow U.S. Senate win might have been wrong. Here's what he said. I struggled with what verb to use, and specifically in the column it says, it appears that non-residents may have tipped the result. I'm still wondering if that was the right word. Moments later, New Hampshire Secretary of State Bill Gardner responded.
The problem that has occurred because of what you wrote is that the question of whether our election, as we have recorded it, is real and valid. And it is real and valid.
So where does this leave Trump's quest to prove there's widespread voter fraud in search of a cure? Joining me are Fergus Cullen, former chair of the New Hampshire Republican Party from 2007 to 2008. Fergus, it's good to see you.
Thank you.
Jim Rappaport is the former chair of the Massachusetts Republican Party from 92 to 97. Jim, good to see you, too. Okay, so the vice chair and the Kansas Secretary of State says there was massive voter fraud. That's why Maggie Hassan beat Kelly Ayotte until he did his Emily Latella from SNL today. Never mind. Not quite. I mean, what was the reaction to that? I wouldn't say a 180, but maybe a 170.
Well, it's not just Chris Kobach who's been saying it. It's the president himself who's alleging that massive voter fraud exists. The reason this commission even exists is to justify the president's contention that massive voter fraud exists.
And that there were busloads coming in from Massachusetts, Vermont, et cetera.
Specifically, people have been bussed in from Massachusetts to vote in New Hampshire.
But Fergus, what was the reaction? He basically undid his incredibly serious allegation today at this hearing in this matter-of-fact kind of way.
I mean, it's a mini Trump, right? I didn't mean what I just said, even though I used very clear language. When he says he misspoke, he wrote a column. It's not like he just said something
we should say.
On Breitbart, which is, I say, a questionable news source. And it's not as though he didn't have time to choose his words carefully. He knew what he was saying.
You know, it's pretty clear here, Jim, he doesn't understand the law. Not only, were his facts wrong, he then makes this comment today allegedly to fix this by saying something about non-residents, not even understanding what the law is, both Supreme Court law and New Hampshire, about students who are domiciled, even if they're not residents in New Hampshire, being able to vote. Doesn't this undercut the credibility of the chief inquisitor here?
First of all, I would like to go back to the fact that there were 6,000 people who, under New Hampshire law, were supposed to go and get licenses.
That happens not to be factually true. There's 6,000 people who did not have driver's licenses, but unlike what Chris Kobach said in Breitbart, they were not required to have driver's licenses to vote. He is factually wrong.
I had read that in something out of New Hampshire. So
what's wrong? But go ahead, next.
So the point is that you had 6,000 people who apparently used identification which was not, turned out to not be accurate. And, you know, when you sit there and I have to use an ID to get into a building in downtown Boston. I used to have to use an ID to get into here to do the filming. Since they know
You're
me
going to
now.
need it next time. Let me tell you after this. But go ahead. I'm sorry, go ahead.
But the point is that there's still this whole concept that we're not supposed to have IDs.
Yeah, but let's think small and then go large. Let's just stay in New Hampshire. What was the reaction, by the way, of the original charge before it was sort of undone today by Kobach? How did New Hampshire Republicans react to the fact that the Republican president's commission and this Republican Secretary of State were making this accusation against the lack of integrity in your electoral system?
Well, you know, Donald Trump has a problem thinking that maybe he lost the popular vote and that it was just that the other candidate got more votes than he did. So that's where it starts. He said this after the election, of course. Last fall, he was talking about the system being rigged, that maybe the outcome would be somehow stolen from him, and he hasn't ever walked away from that. So in New Hampshire, as it happens, I coach in the town of Durham, from New Hampshire, where the University of
Right.
New Hampshire is. The high school I coach at is where that polling precinct is. And it is true that in New Hampshire, if you are a student from Massachusetts or Pennsylvania, you have a driver's license from that state, you can show up on Election Day, get a ballot,
That
cast a
state
vote,
being
and-
Massachusetts or another state.
or in any other state.
As long as you're domiciled, you're going to UNH,
You
for
sign.
example.
You go to the University of New Hampshire. You sign a statement saying that this is where you vote.
So can we just say that to conclude New Hampshire, one, we can agree that Secretary Kobach had no understanding of the law, and two, we can agree after this day of hearings that there's no proof of busloads of voters from out of state illegally being let. That is factually true. Let's get to your point. Even if all that is the case, the New Hampshire charters were untrue, why is he wrong? We do present photo IDs for virtually everything in life. Why shouldn't a voter have to do it when he or she got? And by the way, a lot of states require it now, but why shouldn't?
And now in New
by the
Hampshire,
way,
you do have to show a
and
voter
before you,
ID.
And by the way, the African Americans who I've talked to are so offended that white liberals think that they don't have a license or an ID and that they need to be protected by them.
Well, they haven't. By the way, those African Americans you talk to have not persuaded the courts, because the courts almost universally have said that photo IDs discriminate, are racially discriminatory, whether they think so or not. But what about putting us? Let's put the courts aside for a second. As a practical matter, as Jim Rapport said, why shouldn't everybody show a little ID when they come into the poll?
And in New Hampshire now you do, but that's a relatively recent change in state law that says you have to show an ID. Before, you didn't necessarily have to do that. So the issue here is really one of same-day voter registration, which is allowed in New Hampshire, not in every state. You can be not on the voter rolls, show up on Election Day, produce an identification, get a ballot, cast a ballot, and then walk out. And some people have problems with that.
The underlying issue, let's assume for argument's sake, forget all these court decisions, which we can't, but we will for a minute, about racially discriminatory consequences of photo IDs. You're a very successful business guy. It seems to me if you went to a meeting and someone proposed an action, you'd say, is there a problem for which you're proposing this solution? This is a solution in search of a problem.
Well,
even courts, Jim Rappaport, that have upheld photo ID, like Indiana, for example. The Supreme Court of the United States said Indiana, let me read to you. Supreme Court upholds the Indiana voter ID, and here's what they say. There is no evidence of any in-person voter fraud in Indiana at any time in history. So even though they say it's okay, why should we mandate this thing when there's not a voter fraud problem to begin with?
Well, if for no other reason than it eliminates even having the specter of the potential of that. But for example, in Massachusetts, where we have early voting now, we don't have a system here in Massachusetts where our Secretary of State has not put a system in place yet that allows us to go and determine who has in fact voted early.
So where are you in this whole notion? Is there a voter fraud problem
No,
that you've
absolutely
seen?
not. I mean, there are.
I don't mean just
you
in
can
New
be
Hampshire.
uncomfortable with the law and think that ought to be changed, but that doesn't rise to the level of a massive voter fraud, like a conspiracy. Part of the problem with this commission is it feeds the conspiracy theorists out there. Bill Gardner, a really nice guy, the Secretary
Democrat.
of State, happens to be a Democrat. He's a very earnest guy. He thinks if we just get the facts out there, people will see. No, if we've learned anything in the last 18 months, is that people are going to want to believe what they want to believe, regardless of the facts.
And I don't think there is
but
massive voter fraud in the sense, but I do think that we have a system that allows wiggle room for people to vote in two states.
But when people like Kobach, Secretary Kobach, make irresponsible, unsubstantiated comments like that, the whole purpose of the commission, according to Donald Trump and him, is to restore voter integrity and trust in the system. Isn't he undercutting the very trust that he says he wants to build?
I would suggest that he be clearer on the facts, and it shows you the power of the media. There are now literally millions of people out there who believe that the 6,500 people were required to then go and renew the license.
Last thing, you said what the agenda may be here. There's also a notion that the real agenda of your party, the Republican Party nationally, is to ensure that there's a higher threshold for people to meet, which generally means poorer people, people of color, which means Democratic voters. Do you buy that?
College students. I mean, the issue here in New Hampshire is one of college students from out of state voting and maybe tipping elections by their numbers.
So you do agree
there's
a broader agenda here?
Well, I think that's an issue on the partisan side. But, you're a college student. You are allowed to vote someplace. You're only allowed to vote one place.
And they choose New
and
Hampshire.
Several of them do vote other places.
Verkus, it's great to see you. Good to see you. Fergus Cullen, Jim Rapport. Gentlemen,
Thanks,
thank you. Great to see you both.